This is the Tree of Life, Season 11, Chapter 7. In this episode, we will be drawing out the implications of the last 3 episodes regarding appropriation or displacement mirroring. To start out, we discussed how hybrid structures created by dissonant spaces are chiral. That is to say, they form, relative to the same dialectical impulses, regarding the same objects, in a chiral form with some other. The example given was of the 3 individuals in a corner store. One who chooses to buy candy instead of cigarettes, B, from person A, the store clerk, and person C, who buys cigarettes instead. The idea was that the intersection within some lower convoluted path, between persons A and B, is severed by person C, who substitutes within that path within the same spatial space. The idea was that if you imagine that person A, B, C form a hybrid structure, where for person B, impulse 1 is to buy the sweets, which is affirmed, and impulse 2 is to buy the cigarettes, which is negated, whereas it is the reverse for person C. Then you can see that the alternative, namely, where person B buys the cigarettes, instead, represented by the dissonant space, is replaced perfectly by the substitution of C for B in relation to A. All of this means that first of all, there is attraction between the 2 chiral forms of A, B, C, and second, that the substitution event as between B and C manifests as the displacement of the lower intersection between A and B to C and A. Now, from this we can see that the substitution of person C into the convoluted path of B was described as a form of displacement mirroring. In that, the behavior or impulse represented by the supplanted hybrid structure for B is mirrored by person C, and it was this that was previously called appropriation. Now, from this analysis, we can extrapolate that every corresponding intersection between 2 people, followed by some third, relative to the same objects, represents an opportunity for this displacement mirroring. Thus, we see that the 9 descending paths of increasing convolution represented by an intersection with 9 separate substitution events, represent 9 hybrid structures, whose chiral analog is attractive to some alternate inclusive C, instead of B. From this, we can see that the flattening out of the 9 descending paths, represented by the act of appropriation, the intercession, through some substitution event along some path P, could conceivably represent the distribution of those lower intersections relative to some distinct common objects between innumerable individuals. Which is to say, that the intersection between A and B is not merely one intersection multiplied by some factor related to 9 increasingly convoluted paths, but rather, through the substitution events along those paths, the intersections between A and B, C, D, E, etc. Which is to say, that time parsimony substitutes laterally instead of linearly. Now, why does it do this? Since we see that each set of dialectical impulses corresponds to a distinct pairing of objects, which are spatially anchored to some local context, we can see that there is a transformation of nesting vertically, that is, between A and B horizontally. Which is to say, that interactions between A and B find some common relation with interactions between A and C, D, E, etc. relative to B. In other words, in the absence of time parsimony, dissonant spaces reflect a local layering of intersection, whereas, in the presence of time parsimony, their absence reflects a global separation, through dialectical relations to some common objects. This interrelation between intersection independent of who, subjectively, is participating in said intersections, tells us something about the interrelation between parallel selves and lateral selves. That's the end of the podcast for today.